Open the pod bay doors.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What would you do with a brain if you had one?
Do? Why, if I had a brain, I could...
Miles per hour.
I could while away.
46.56 degrees.
So I should say, inviting a birder and an ornithologist, we're used to listening to things more than talking. But
Are you going to be okay?
yeah, I think I'll be okay. But I know I'm kind of singing to the choir of the flock here too, as I already heard a few birders are out there. So.
All right, thank you. I'm
Sure.
going to leave and let you go.
All right, sure. And I should say, to make it clear, I haven't seen the movie yet. So like a few of you, I've seen the trailer, and I can just speak to what I think it's going to cover in some ways, and then also put in a bunch of my personal stories about being a birder and kind of a professional birder, an ornithologist. So one thing that I really like about birding is that it's really accessible to just about anyone. And there are many different paths to becoming a birder, as you can see, with these different types of people that are all birders in a bird club that are going to be in this movie. And so obviously there's different types of birders as well that come along with all that variation in birders. There are people that are hardcore listers. So what we call a lister is someone or the Brits call a twitcher, are people that are really just looking for numbers. So being able to tick off as many species as possible that they can see in their life. And that probably tends more to the OCD part of the spectrum. But I've even heard of birders that on their international travels keep track of all the types of planes they've flown on. So you can see how this can really turn into a game, a never-ending game, really, of keeping track of things. I've been able to turn it into a career studying birds, so I get to practice my hobby while I'm at work, which is kind of a nice scheme. So basically, I just wanted to kind of introduce myself and how you can get at least my one man's version of getting into a career, a rewarding career via birds, but also kind of my personal journey a little bit in short in getting there from being a young boy in northwestern Illinois. So I'm going to start with a nice little story though. So when you think about speaking at these kind of things, you want to go for kind of the high points in your career and then look backwards, I think. So, but also being a scientist, I'm really literal sometimes, so I was thinking about high points, and then one of my projects in 2000, I was collecting DNA samples from bird eggs, so I had to get up to some pretty high nests, and my advisor at the time gave me this paper, which I think maybe in retrospect he might have been trying to get rid of me, but the paper was entitled Guide Extension Ladder for Access to High Nests. That sounds interesting, doesn't it? So next slide, please, Stefan. So this is what this looked like, and when you're young, you just kind of go do things like this. And so here I was at the top of this ladder, 35 feet up there, and it kind of moves around a bit, collecting an egg that I needed to get down to incubate to get a DNA sample from. And you really don't want to carry an egg in your hands when you're doing that, so necessity being the mother of invention, in this case a one-time invention, I put the egg in my mouth and climbed down. And the whole way I was thinking about where that egg came from. And I can tell you after spitting several times, I never did that again. But the egg did make it down safely, so thank you. The price people pay for learning more about birds. So next slide, please. So again, I just wanted to talk about, at that moment when I got down, I was like, how did I get here? Why am I doing this? And I just kind of wanted to go full circle. So I started here probably about 10 or 11 years old with my brother raising rabbits. Of course, we started with one and then we had more. But that led to conservation projects in 4-H and obviously an interest in animals. Next slide, please. And birds were really ever present on the landscape in Illinois and the remaining grasslands. We were lucky enough to live on 3 acres of restored prairie there. But I really took to birds because you could interact with them somewhat directly through feeders and nest boxes and really kind of see more into their otherwise secret lives. Next slide, please. And then, after taking a bit of a hiatus from the nature thing in high school, I was in undergrad, convinced I was going to be a microbiologist working in a lab one day, and I happened to take a vertebrates course, and we had a guest speaker who spoke about working on birds in the tropics, and I went up to him afterwards and asked, how could you get a job like that working on birds? And he said, well, what are you doing this summer? So that was kind of my entree point, but I was armed with a telescopic pole with a retrofitted car mirror, and then I was a nest monitor, so I was monitoring nests in the woods in southern Illinois and then northern Illinois. And again, really seeing these kind of secret sides of birds' lives, how tough it is to be a bird. Most birds that migrate here from thousands of miles away to attempt to nest every year have only about between a 30 and a 50% chance of having a successful nest per attempt. So it's really eye-opening what these birds go through. I mean, if you were to ask a human to do that, they would basically just say no way. I mean, it's like a superhuman feat or Olympic feat to be able to travel that far and then do it all for a slim chance of some reproductive gains. So anyhow, I learned more about science and birds that way, and basically took field jobs that I would work about every 3 months in different locations, which was a great way to see the world, but then also kind of have it paid for through the job. Next slide, please. So again, this is just more on the secret lives of birds, and I must apologize because the next slide, for anyone who's afraid of snakes, might give you some nightmares. But next slide, please. This is from a study I did in my postdoctoral work in Wisconsin, but we used cameras at nests, and we actually had quite a few kind of miniature Godzilla epic battles between snakes and birds. This is a meadowlark that actually got caught by the snake and then was able to get away. But just more that you can learn about through applying technology. I think that's one underlying thing that I see is, I mean, questions beget more questions, but also just how little we know about this planet and the life forms on it. And so by looking, the more we look, the more we learn. So I really think that can also give you a different appreciation beyond, I guess, just listing species that you might see in a day. So this is a little more in depth. So the next slide, please. Another type of technology I worked with is the Geo Locator, which basically is just a really accurate clock that you're able to set. Needs to be lightweight to be carried by smaller birds, and it records every day the length of the day. So from that, and knowing the location where you deployed it, you can tell where a bird's been because it records that information, how long it was bright each day. So I've been able to study several species here, looking at their migratory patterns with this technology. So you can see there's a bit of a gee whiz factor with a lot of this too. But it all can be applied to conservation as well. Next slide, please. And then these are kind of the community of birds that I've been working with most recently for the past 8 years here on the prairies. These are all grassland birds. These are our most imperiled group of birds in North America, and most of them have been in decline since the 1960s, with the Breeding Bird Survey being the first way we could start to count their populations. And 5 of these species have declined by over 70% since that time. So that's why we're working on these species and really working to help keep ranchers ranching to help keep grassland right side up and maintain large tracts of grassland for these grassland birds. So next slide, please. And I mentioned travel. These are all the places I have bird lists from and have worked. So again, those 3-month field jobs, and then I think it's something like 17 years of higher education got me traveling around, so you can see that it's a good way to see the world. And it really adds a different dimension to travel too. Oftentimes I can remember birds I saw when I hear the name of a location. It really does change how you travel in some ways when you have an opportunity to sneak in some birding, and what might you see before you get there. You start to do research on what you might see, and how you might be able to work with a guide to go see different species that you might not have seen or be interested in. There's also pros and cons. I must confess that for me to go camping in a new location to show up at night is kind of torture, because in the morning I just lay there, the pre-dawn chorus, starting to listen and identifying birds as if they're different instruments in an orchestra or something. So invariably you hear something new, and then you want to climb out of the sleeping bag and go find out what it is. So there's pros and cons. Another con is watching old westerns and hearing birds that are out east, you know, they soundtrack in the wrong species. So it's a minor thing, but so another curse of being a birder. Next slide, please. And then another great point that I just wanted to make about birds is that they really do function as, I mean, people have said canary in a coal mine. I work in grasslands, so we like to say canary in the prairie. But this is a book that really speaks to how birds can really be sentinels for all different types of threats that might also face humanity. This one's really focused on diseases like West Nile virus and worse diseases. But certainly birds are great indicators of changing habitats and could signal changes, whether it's climate change or other aspects that we might want to be alerted to through birds rather than finding out the hard way ourselves first. Next slide. So I was just going to give you a little bit of background before we step into the movie. And again, I've only seen the trailer, so I'm just trying to go with some basics here. But I can tell from the trailer that the young birders are pretty excited to think they've found this extinct duck, which would be like akin for kids, I know there's a few kids here, to finding like an ultra rare Pokemon. So this was the first bird species that was unique to North America to go extinct. So it went extinct sometime around 1875. This is what it looked like. We know it from just over 50 specimens, which I'll tell you about in a second, but I just wanted to show in terms of scientific correctness, this is where that species occurred along the northeastern coast during the winter, and it was a shellfish or mussel-eating duck. And it's thought that it was largely driven to extinction through a combination of hunting and development along those shorelines where it would have gone. I mean, obviously those were the first colonists were, and a lot of shipping and a lot of habitat changes occurring in those areas, and then they bred further north up into Canada. So. Next slide, please. I was just going to mention this. This is another great example of how quirky birders and bird scientists can be. But there is a book out there that's actually written by a fellow student of the same graduate advisor I had. Shelton is the person who set forth to find every remaining taxidermized Labrador duck. And he was able to debunk several that weren't. And basically, he went to the point where he feels that he's tracked down and examined all 55 remaining specimens, and he's even offering a $10,000 reward to anyone who can lead him to another one. So there you go. If you need a get-rich scheme, there's one there. So, and the next slide, please. And I just wanted to kind of take advantage of having this appearance on stage to really promote birding. I really think for people that, whether you're an established birder or really maybe even new to it, you might still say things like, oh, there's a bird, without having it actually know what it is. So I can't remember when I last said that. But this is a really great site, like a one-stop site, where you can see information in a lot of different ways, where you can see where people have seen different types of birds, and you can also report birds that you've found. And then there are also links to other programs as well on this site. So I really just kind of pitch it as a nexus. It's run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they have several other sites and apps as well that are helpful. As far as apps, I mean, that's kind of in some ways replaced the old field guide, which was a little big to carry in your pocket. But the phone apps I would recommend. Audubon has a pretty good one. And Cornell Lab for Beginners has one called Merlin, where you basically, based on your location, the GPS in your phone, really narrows down what you might be seeing based on like 6 questions that you answer and tries to get to the bird that you might be seeing. So next slide, please. Also for young folks, which again was a theme of the Science on Screen series and this film in particular, I just wanted to point out this is a link from that Cornell site and the eBird site for the Young Birders Network, and then there's also information on how to go about setting up your own young birding club if you had an interest. So again, I'd encourage you to go to that site, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the next slide, please, the Sacagawea Audubon Society Club. A great group of folks working locally. They run things that you might have heard about or seen on the news, like the Christmas bird count, which has been running, I think, since like 1908. So it's the oldest, longest running Christmas bird count in the state. So you can see how citizen science efforts like that could really contribute a long-term data set to looking at things like climate change and bird population changes. But as you can see over here on the side too, they do have a lot of things on their calendar, great for a lot of beginners and also experienced birders, a lot of field trips, and I think April 27th or so, cut off the calendar there, there's actually a beginning birding field trip. So I would just highly recommend you talk to folks here that might be members or go to their website to find out more information. So that was my last slide, and I hope you enjoy the movie. I think I will as well, and feel free to stop me and ask me questions after the movie or anytime you see me around. Thanks.